All right, cool. All right, guys, it's study group time. Yay! Okay, so let me type that in here. Study group. No personal. I'll put questions. Because people don't understand when I say reading. Sometimes they're like, I don't know what that means, but I just have a personal question. I just have a personal question, Mr. Fernando. All right. Hey, guys. All right. Y'all ready? Cool. Okay, cool. So we're doing the Eckhart Tolle, A New Earth. So that's what we're doing here. So what we do for study group is I read, and then I stop and I comment and express my own opinion and and give my examples of my experience, etc. So that's pretty much what we do. So for those of you tuning in, if you're tuning in and you want to ask a personal question, sorry guys, that wasn't the last hour. Now we're in study group time. So this is only questions pertaining to the subject matter. So the subject matter is this book, the information we discuss, or spiritual topical questions, not personal questions, spiritual topical questions. So like, what are guardian angels? That's a spiritual topical questions. What's the name of my guardian angel is a personal question. Difference, right? So that's what we do for the study group, guys. So all right, so I'm gonna get started here because I'm gonna get off a little early today just because I want to go walking, and I'm changing my schedule, y'all. Next week the lives and the study groups are going to be pushed back by 1 hour just because here where I live at in New Mexico, the sun is going down a lot earlier, and so now is the time of year where I change my schedule so that way I can go for my walk before it's dark and pitch black outside. And so next week we're going to be pushing everything back by 1 hour. That way I have enough time for my daily walks. Okay, so the last place we left off at was on chapter 4, page 85 of A New Earth by Eckhart Tolle. Role-playing the many faces of the ego. An ego that wants something from another and what ego doesn't will usually play some kind of role to get its needs met, be they material gain, a sense of power, superiority, or specialness, or some kind of gratification, be it physical or psychological. Usually, people are completely unaware of the roles they play. They are those roles. Some roles are subtle, others are blatantly obvious, except to the person playing it. Some roles are designed simply to get attention from others. The ego thrives on others' attention, which is, after all, a form of psychic energy. The ego doesn't know that the source of all energy is within you, so it seeks it outside. It is not the formless attention which is presence that the ego seeks, but attention in some form, such as recognition, praise, admiration, or just to be noticed in some way, to have its existence acknowledged. A shy person who is afraid of the attention of others is not free of ego, but has an ambivalent ego that both wants and fears attention from others. The fear is that the attention may take the form of disapproval or criticism. That is to say, something that diminishes the sense of self rather than enhances it. So the shy person's fear of attention is greater than his or her need of attention. Shyness often goes with a self-concept that is predominantly negative, the belief of being inadequate. Any conceptual sense of self, seeing myself as this or that, is ego, whether predominantly positive, I am the greatest, or negative, I am no good. Behind every positive self-concept is the hidden fear of not being good enough. Behind every negative self-concept is the hidden desire of being the greatest or better than others. Behind the confident ego's feeling of and continuing need for superiority is the unconscious fear of inferiority. Conversely, the shy, inadequate ego that feels inferior has a strong hidden desire for superiority. Many people fluctuate between feelings of inferiority and superiority, depending on situations or the people they come into contact with. All you need to know and observe in yourself is this: whenever you feel superior or inferior to anyone, that's the ego in you. Villain, victim, or lover. Some egos, if they cannot get praise or admiration, will settle for other forms of attention and play roles to elicit them. If they cannot get positive attention, they may seek negative attention instead. for example, by provoking a negative reaction in someone else. Some children already do that too. They misbehave to get attention. The plane of negative roles becomes particularly pronounced whenever the ego is magnified by an active pain body. That is to say, emotional pain from the past that wants to renew itself through experiencing more pain. Some egos perpetuate crimes in their search for fame. They seek attention through notoriety and other people's condemnation. Please tell me that I exist, that I am not insignificant. They seem to say, such pathological forms of ego are only more extreme versions of normal egos. And I'll stop there because I want to make mention of this. So some egos, and this whole because we're in the genre of trolls, meaning that there's trolls in every area of life. And so when you go online, you've got trolls that are in every aspect of every human connection. Every person on there, whether they're good or bad, whether they do great things or not great things, are going to have trolls around them. And the thing about it is, someone who's a troll, what they do is they essentially will, someone who's a troll, essentially what they do is they, oh look, I'm on my other, oh yeah. I'm like, what am I doing here? People who are trolls, they are trying to elicit a reaction. And they're eliciting a reaction for one of two reasons. Either because they're trying to prove to the world that they are superior in some way, shape, or form by making someone else's inferiority obvious, or they're simply trying to create they're trying to create and elicit a reaction and a response from the world just to get attention, because that's the only attention they're getting. People who get plenty of attention, you won't see them on social media, or you're not going to see them online being as involved in that communication or that connection. Like some of these people who are professional movie stars or actresses or singers or whatever, some of them are definitely attention whores because they spend too much time online. And I'm like, aren't you supposed to be working? But for the most part, most people who are pros in their industry and who know their worth and value are not really on social media very often, or don't do a lot with the commenting of social media as far as being in the chats and stuff like that. And so that's just the way it is, because they know their worth and value. They know what they bring to the table. They know that they have something to offer the world, and they're very settled and at peace with that. But then you got people who just want to call out people or get attention. So you got a bunch of Paris Hiltons running around and acting as trolls in different environments where they're just simply trying to trigger people or elicit some sort of attention because that's what they want. Some of these people are people who in person would never say or do what they do online. And that's because they have a real fear, or they have a real anxiety around those kinds of confrontational situations in person. So they use this as a way to be able to get what they want and the attention that they want without actually having to take a real risk and put themselves out there. So you got a lot of these people who are professional trolls, and that's all they do. And then when you call them out on it, they act like, oh, this is just me trolling. This is not serious. But you have to remember that people do take that seriously. People do react. People do respond. People are fed and fueled by that. If you have one ignorant bastard in a feed making specific comments, that person is going to create a situation where it makes it okay to be that way. And then others who feel it's okay to be that way become this way. This is one of the reasons why I had such a huge issue. And for those of you who are Trumpers, you better get off right now, because I'm about to go into a little bit of a spill. Why regardless of policies, regardless of whatever, I in the very beginning was very much against Trump being the one to take seriously, just because, regardless of his policies, regardless of his business, decisions, how he responds in that way, as a person, I do not want an example like that being put out into this world, because I was worried that if you have someone who is that powerful, who and it's okay for them to behave and operate this way, it's going to set an example and precedence for others to be able to do the same. And that is exactly what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a lot of people who were empowered to be, and at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what you think about him as a person, but when you put someone like that in a position where they set a standard, the standard can go up or the standard could go down. And so that's when you want to have someone who is going to represent something in a very good way. So that way the standard doesn't go down, or so that way people are not, they don't feel fueled into behaving in the same way as well and thinking that it's okay. They're normalizing that behavior. In other words, here's an example of this. So I once had a friend, and this friend she told me about a relationship she was in, and she had mentioned that her boyfriend had slammed her up against the wall. And so I immediately went into defensive mode, and I was like, why are you still with this person? That is unacceptable behavior. And you're basically telling them by not walking away from that situation, or by not forcing that person to go into some sort of anger management program, you're making it okay for this person to behave this way because there's no real consequence to their action. There's no real consequence to what they've done to you. And so it's okay for them. So they're going to be able to do other things like this and feel like it's okay. And so I was really bothered that that my friend allowed this to happen. And I was like, what did your friend say? And she's like, oh, well, my friends, they said, sometimes people get mad, or sometimes people have it out. And I was like, your friends are idiots. They're probably used to shitty ass relationships with some shitty ass people, and that's normal for them. That's a problem, because that's just normalized your experience in this situation, and it's allowing it to be normalized. Well, lo and behold, years later, after being with this person for several years, they actually had their life threatened by this person, and it was a very physically scary situation for them. So it's like, because they allowed that behavior and it was acceptable. It is not acceptable. It is not acceptable. Violence in any way, shape, or form is not acceptable. They are layers and levels of violence, but at the end of the day, violence against others is not acceptable under any circumstance or condition. Even though it is still there are going to be situations where it's required because of the situation in the moment. If someone is coming at me and I respond by protecting myself, I'm acting in a violent way against that person. But again, violence on that level is not acceptable. And so the standard is a standard that shifts around and moves and changes. So you look at people who are in positions of authority, or you put people in positions of power who do not represent or who do not set a good example, and you get a lot of normalizing of behavior, and then it creates this tidal wave of the same bullshit from other people as well. So people always say, well, racism has always been here. Yes, it has. Racism exists. It's always going to exist, because people are always going to team up or group themselves with their clans or with people they feel more connected to. And so racism is always going to be something that is an issue from the idea that people want to go and mix with their own kind, or mix with people that they have something in common with. And then you have people who use that and then they turn it into, but everybody else is not okay. Everybody else is not acceptable. Everybody else is not allowed. So it creates this dynamic that it's only okay to be with my kind. It's not okay to mix or to interact or to sustain or support others who are different. And so it creates a normacy. It creates a standard that is not healthy and that is quite destructive to the human plight. So we have to take these things into consideration and be very careful about this. And so that's why it's important that we do not normalize things that create a complete tidal wave of more of the same. And this is why I tell people, if you want love in your life, create love and put it out there first. If you want to have more money in your life, then focus on your own money situation and do the best you can with that first before you start wishing for money to come and bail you out. Because you have to exemplify, you have to do first what you desire in this world, before you can expect the world to return that to bring that back to you or to return that to you. So you have to be the example. You have to set the precedence. And so that's important for us, that we understand that whoever we give the stage to, and whoever we allow a platform. Oprah had it right when she did her show about the KKK, when she said she had them on there once, she didn't have them back again, and she wasn't going to have them because they were using that as a recruitment video, and they were also getting more notoriety, and it was also giving them a platform. She had it right. And so we've given a lot of people who should not have platforms. Same thing with what I was saying earlier about parents. We've given people who should not be parents children. And so it's like, okay, and then it becomes a normalized behavior. How many people do you know who were sexually abused or had to deal with some sort of abuse in their families or in their life? There's a lot more people who had to deal with it than there are people who didn't have to deal with it at this point. So it's a normalized behavior, and that's why we have to catch it and nip it in the bud. So going back to this, a very common role in one of victim and the form of attention it seeks is sympathy or pity or others' interest in my problems, me and my story. Seeing oneself as a victim is an element in many egoic patterns, such as complaining, being offended, outraged, and so on. Of course, once I am identified with a story in which I assigned myself the role of victim, I don't want it to end, and so as every therapist knows, the ego does not want to end, and its to its problems, because they are part of its identity. If no one will listen to my sad story, I can tell it to myself in my head over and over and feel sorry for myself. And so have an identity as someone who is being treated unfairly by life or other people, fate or God. It gives definition to my self-image, makes me into someone, and that is all that matters to the ego. In the early stages of my so-called romantic relationships, role-playing is quite common. In the early stages of many so-called romantic relationships, role-playing is quite common in order to attract and keep whoever is perceived by the ego as the one who is going to make me happy, make me feel special, and fulfill all my needs. I'll play who you want me to be, and you'll play who I want you to be. That's the unspoken and unconscious agreement. This is exactly what happens. People in the first 3 or 4 months of any relationship, most people will be a version of themselves that they think is ideal or that is not authentic and genuine to who they really are. So this is why people fall in love in that first period, because people are being a version of themselves more acceptable, or that simply makes them more palatable. You got a guy who's an asshole and he's just always jumping around from relationship to relationship, but he actually doesn't want a relationship. He just wants to feel in love. Then, he's going to do what he has to do to get you to fall in love with him or to get that feeling from you. That doesn't mean that he's boyfriend material, that he's your soulmate. It just means that he's a shitty person who needs attention. And so you figure that out 3 or 4 months into the relationship. You got someone who she is just super sweet, super polite, super kind, and comes across very compassionate or genuine, and then 3 or 4 months into the relationship she switches and puts her bitch face on, and that's who she truly and genuinely is, because she's like, okay, I've got you now you fall in love with me, or now you're connected, and now I can be a version of myself that I'm comfortable with. And so that's who she becomes. She switches over. And so people have a rude awakening usually in 3 or 4 months of a relationship. That's why I tell people, like, if you're building a relationship with someone, you're involved with someone, wait 3 or 4 months before you decided this is someone you really want to spend more time with or you want to take more seriously. Because people usually let their guard down and show their true faces after 3 or 4 months. And then you can decide authentically and genuinely whether this is going to work for you or not. That's what happened with my ex. 3 or 4 months into the relationship, his true colors came out, and then that was when I realized who he really was. But I was stuck on the version of him that he presented to me within the first 3 or 4 months. And so that's why I was stuck on that person for so long, just because I fell in love with the version of them, not with the genuine person beneath the version. And that, when I realized who that was, all it elicited was hatred, anger, resentment, rage, and I was blaming them for things when it was my downfall, because I accepted the fake version of them and I didn't give them a chance to show themselves to me. That's why it's important that we wait to see people for who they really are and pay attention, because we're really good at turning ourselves into something to be loved or to be accepted. But to actually be genuine and authentic and not everyone liking that's a challenge, and that's hard. I know this because this is what I've been practicing and really trying to focus on for the last 2 years of my life. Being a version of myself that isn't always acceptable. Being a version of myself that doesn't fit with the status quo of a psychic or a medium or a spiritual teacher. Being a version of myself that isn't palatable. And so I've intentionally been more authentic versions of myself, even when to me people to stay in my life, or people who wanted to be involved with me, because I needed people to know who I really am, and I wasn't going to be a version of me that I was taught to be growing up and conditioned to be, because I wanted love or I wanted to receive that connection with people. So that's why it's important. It takes work and time and practice though, y'all. Being an authentic version of yourself is not about thinking about how you want to be. It's just feeling who you really are and what's natural and normal for you, and deciding if that's what you choose, or if you choose a different set of qualities or different traits or different practices. And then you can choose that person. You can choose that part of yourself. Just because you're used to being, a jerk to people doesn't mean you should stay that way. That doesn't even mean that that's an authentic version of you. That's just a version of you. You've become really used to, and it's now a standard for you. And so that's considered an authentic version of you, unless you choose differently. And we get to choose who we're going to be in this world every single day of our lives. Who do you choose to be today versus yesterday? Who do you choose to be tomorrow versus today? Choose, and you get to choose, you get to pick that. But it takes practice to step into that persona, to step into those qualities, to step into those choices, because those choices are not always natural for us. Let's go to here. I'm seeing what you is the ego playing the victim. The ego is no, the ego, and I don't agree with his version of the ego, and he's giving us his take on the ego, but I don't agree with his version of the ego, because for me the ego is a mechanism. I think of the ego as like a cone. You know, whenever you're like putting spices in a little jar and you have to put a little cone, or if you're putting oil in the car and you have a little cone that you have to pour it in, the ego is like that cone. The ego, it centralizes elements, aspects, ideas, traits. It utilizes and condenses all of this experience, all of these different elements of our persona. It condenses it into a persona, into a personality, into a person. So Ferny is the ego version of me. Ferny is the ego version of me that is produced by this mechanism of traits, qualities, experiences, etc. So that's what the ego is, and that's how I see the ego. People think of the ego as like you've got a little angel and a little devil, and the ego is the devil. No, I don't choose to see it that way, because I think it does a disservice to the ego. The ego is doing its job. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to condense elements and aspects and experiences and energy into a persona, into a perspective. And that's what we're here to experience through that unique form and unique being. If you destroy that, you have no personality. You have no real, if you destroy it, which you can't destroy the ego, it's always there. But people, they work on the ego, or they try to squish it or diminish it. And that's fine. You can do that. There's nothing wrong with that. But the ego's doing its job, and it does it very well. But sometimes the ego gets a bit too rowdy, and the ego has way too much power and control. And then it starts to spiral into a lot of disruptive and toxic and unhealthy habits and lifestyle and ideas and thought patterns, etc. And that's when you get into trouble, because when you associate too much with your ego, I'm Ferny in this lifetime, but I'm not represented solely by Ferny. Ferny's just a version of me that I'm using in this lifetime to experience through that perspective. But the version of me that is genuine and authentic beyond what my ideas are, what my choices are, what my behaviors and traits and responses and reactions and experiences and conditioning, the version of me beneath all of that is a lot grander and a lot more expansive, and it's much, much more evolved in its understanding and its expression of love, expression of acceptance, because it's much more closely aligned to God than it is to me as a persona. The persona that I exist as, who I am, Ferny, is a flawed version of Source, but it is a usable and it is a productive version of Source. So just because it isn't a perfect representation of God doesn't mean that it isn't doing what it's supposed to do. Doesn't mean that that doesn't mean that I'm not being who I'm supposed to be in this world. I am who I am supposed to be in this world. And I know who I am, and I experience myself, and I practice and choose through choices what I'm going to continue to support and sustain. And if I need to adjust myself or change because I choose it, because I feel the need is there, then I would do that and I'll work on that. But the ego is just that like funnel. But people, like I said, like when you talk about him and Eckhart Tolle, he demonizes the ego. The ego's the devil. The ego's the evil version of us. Whatever. I'm like, okay, whatever. Like you can see it that way, but you're doing a disservice to the ego, because it serves a purpose. Just like people hate vehicles and cars, but they still drive them to get to work. It serves its purpose, even if it could be destructive or it's causing issues. And so that's kind of how you have to see it with the ego, and that's how I choose to see it. When those roles, however, role playing is hard work, and so those roles cannot be sustained indefinitely, especially once you start living together. When those roles slip, what do you see? Unfortunately, in most cases, not yet the true essence of that being, but that which covers up the true essence, the raw ego divested of its roles, with its pain body and its thwarted wanting, which now turns into anger, most likely directed at the spouse or partner for having failed to remove the underlying fear and sense of lack that is intrinsic part of the egoic sense of self. What is commonly called falling in love is in most cases an intensification of egoic. That was it. So just as rare. So I'll stop there because again, I'm going to get off here a little early. So I just want to answer a couple questions before